Evening, everyone, and welcome to this evening exploring the value of public art. When the planners of this iconic building complex were gathered in tonight, envisioned what this square block of Midtown Manhattan would become, they set out not to build a typical corporate office tower with public areas, but you could think of it instead as a public building with public office space, private office space, with meeting space and a religious sanctuary. That distinction, emphasizing public versus private space, and beginning with the public space as the foundation of this new building, is not in City Corp Center splitting hairs. It's an intentional one. 21 different ways of moving in and out of and around what was then called Citibank Center, public corridors and passageways that led between theater and bank, office tower, retail stores like Conrad's, and oversized living room behind those red doors, and an outdoor public plaza. Here, all of that public space is highlighted in yellow. In the midst of that center sat two spaces in which to dwell: a grand atrium and a human-scaled chapel. One metal and glass with places to gather and talk and visit. The other made of wood and paint, a womb for the soul, to borrow Christopher Rothko's description of Nevilleson Chapel. 40 years on, these two exceedingly public spaces are undergoing renewal. Both have been fundamentally altered by post-9/11 security concerns. Here, we experienced the elimination of many of these 21 different passageways, cordoning off one contiguous public space into several discrete units. Our post-9/11 world has brought about a dramatic shift in the ways in which we all experience public space. The need to protect and limit access has been followed in so many instances, and we see so many of them all over the city, by the need to monetize or to turn to entertainment, or in some cases to gimmick. The inherent value of digging into our shared humanity, into society, into social capital, these are increasingly at risk of becoming antique ideas, vestiges of a day long gone. Here, in this place, we are eagerly awaiting the reopening of the glorious public space that is the atrium. Our partners at Boston Properties are pressing ahead as diligently as possible with that project and are seeking to intentionally connect this project with the neighborhood and with its people, a cut above some other ventures in the city. And just as Boston Properties is pressing ahead with the atrium, so too here we're pressing forward with Nevilleson Chapel. We are glad that after months of construction, the chapel is finally open again to the public, even while work continues within and in anticipation of the art conservation yet to come. And so it is in the midst of this very active reactivation of public space that we gather this night. Grateful for an opportunity to reflect, we had hoped with a public servant, but this night with a distinguished artist, scholar, and municipal official, about the ways in which our public spaces shape us, about the public space of the former Citibank Center in general, and about the public art that is Nevilleson Chapel in particular. Nevilleson called this place a gift to the universe. Certainly it has been a gift to many of us in this room. It is a gift to the city, a gift to this neighborhood, and most especially now we're considering how it becomes a gift to the future. One thing we know, if we do not tend to this gift, no one else will, and its future will be lost. And that, dear friends, is what tonight is about. Probing the ways in which we intentionally invest in our city, its people, its cultural heritage, and its shared experience. In this, our generation, and for the sake of generations to come. We'll take a bit of an unconventional approach to introducing our conversation partners. Their biographical sketches are in your program, and if you Google each of them, you can read of their marvelous work on behalf of the public. And so I thought, instead of a way of an introduction, an introductory process that you really can't find online, I've asked each of our panelists to name a public work that has had an enduring impact on them, and to say in a sentence or two or three what that impact has been to them over all these years. For example, I recall very early on in my childhood experiencing Marc de Suvierot's Victor's Lament, installed since 1970 on the quad at Muhlenberg College in Allentown, Pennsylvania, where I grew up. That work spoke volumes to me about the importance of art, that it has a place in the academy, a place in my life, and a place in the lives of college students, which, as a kid who had no one in my family who had ever gone to college, I had aspired to be able to go to college one day. So Marc's Victor's Lament is deep in my heart. I'm going to give them a few seconds to think about their pieces while I say a word and greet you on behalf of our Congresswoman Carolyn Maloney. We had very much been looking forward to this night. In fact, it was her staff that chose this very date. It's been on her calendar now for the better part of 7 months, and she was very much looking forward to being with us. We congratulate Carolyn that a couple of weeks ago she was elected as the chair of the House Oversight Committee, which is a committee very deeply engaged in the proceedings in Washington, D.C., and today, she very sadly got called back to Washington, D.C. and was unable to be with us this night. In her place, she has sent a letter. I'll read a part of it because I think bringing her into this conversation is helpful, and this is the time to do it. She says, "I wish I could be there in person to celebrate the reopening of the chapel with all of you. Since I had to return to Washington, D.C. for votes, I did think it important to pass along my support and my best wishes. Completed in 1977, Louise Nevelson's Chapel of the Good Shepherd is located in the 12th Congressional District, which I am so proud to represent. This oasis of peace and introspection in the midst of Midtown Manhattan was created by the 20th century's premier abstract expressionist sculptor. Like me, Ms. Nevelson was a big supporter of public art, and I am pleased that federal funding from the National Endowment for the Humanities was available to help underwrite the restoration to ensure the sculptures are available to the future generations in this city Ms. Nevelson loved so much. I will continue to fight to keep federal funding available for this and for public works of art. I must also recognize the Nevelson Legacy Council, a group of art professionals, cultural leaders, and philanthropic citizens, and its dedication to preserving this work in perpetuity. Together with St. Peter's Church and Boston Properties, the Nevelson Council's work ensures that this amazing space will be available to a diverse mix of residents, workers, and tourists for years to come. Sincerely, Carolyn B. Maloney." So we'll now turn to, I don't know, which of the three of you would like to go first? Leo? Yeah.
Sure, why not? Well, Richard Sayre's Tilted Art. Like I said, for all the right and wrong reasons. Just the sheer idea of an artwork saying, I exist. Also, the timing of it, I think, it pushed us to awakeness. Just the very idea that it was this running interference. If you were going to work, there it was. We were coming out of work, there it was. For artists, it was just a celebration of the sheer weight of our existence. And I just thought it was very special, a special moment. And just the very idea that it did cause so much controversy, it just allowed us to sort of know that, public art, the very idea that it can be this decorative, this earring, it's like, just threw that out and said, I exist.
Are we going in order? Okay. I was actually going to talk about the tilted art, but yes, because it's such a very, visual artwork. But I'm going to actually talk about a work that I included in some of the images. So image number 8, and see it here. Yep. So this is a project by an artist, one of our projects at the Percent for Art program, by an artist, Ellen Harvey, and it's in Myrtle Avenue in Bed-Stuy in Brooklyn, and it's called Mathematical Star. And if you are walking through this community and you may not live there, you're passing through, you see this beautiful mosaic, and that's all you understand it to be, then that's fine. But if you live there, this would have a more deeper meaning for you, because you may realize that some of the images that you're seeing illustrated in this, the diamonds in that makes up that mathematical star, are recognizable. And each one, if you could go to the next image, each one of those diamonds represent a place that is historically significant or culturally significant in that community. And it sort of allows for people to understand the community in a very different way through art. In this image, you also see a whole bunch of kids, and Ellen is the woman in the black. And the kids are from this organization called Children of Promise. And these are kids whose parents are both incarcerated. And this artwork was used, without our knowledge, was used as an opportunity to do a scavenger hunt with these kids and to show them the places that their community, that's very important to their communities, and sort of inspire them. And so I chose this piece to talk about because when we commission works of art, we wanted to do a number of things. We wanted to have this, for lack of a better word, a wow factor, to something that draws you to it. But when you investigate it, there's some deeper meaning that's there, and it allows for people who interact with it to give it new purpose. And so this exemplifies all that when I say public art and how we envision a public artwork, it does that in one simple piece. So that's what I wanted to talk about first.
Can you say what it meant to you, what it means to you?
You know, I've been working in public art for many years, and having gone through certain projects that are very controversial, projects that are very on the surface beautiful and emblematic of what people think of public art, it meant a lot to me that an artwork could communicate to a community in a way that's very meaningful. And this idea of communication with meaning it means a lot to me in an artwork. And so that's one of the reasons why I'm in the field that I am right now. So.
Do you know the date of it, about when it was made?
This one was in maybe early 2000s, I think, yeah. And it's mosaic. It's a ceramic and glass mosaic in the ground, obviously.
So that brings up some interesting issues about maintenance and conservation stuff.
Exactly.
That are relevant.
Yes.
Michele, before we go into the conversation, would you share a work of art that has meant?
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of works. I mean, Tilted Arc obviously was very important, and I was there, you know. And, but when asked to think about a work of art that had made a big impression, what came immediately to mind is a work, unfortunately, we don't have a picture of it, but it's called Civic Virtue. It's a statue in marble by an artist, a very prominent artist at the time named Frederick McMonnies, and it was commissioned by the mayor of the city of New York at that time, George B. McClellan, in 1909. So it's part of a kind of progressive era ideal of good government. It wasn't finished until 1922, and when it first was unveiled, it was immediately controversial. And it remained controversial pretty much ever since that point. It's very influenced by Michelangelo, Michelangelo's David. So it depicts a male allegorical figure of virtue, civic virtue, city virtue, standing astride two sea creatures who are feminine, who represented vice. And so one of the reasons that it was controversial from the beginning was that it coincided somewhat with the passage of the 19th Amendment, giving women the right to vote, and women, before they even saw the actual work, took umbrage at the imagery. And it stood in front of City Hall. And in the 30s, Mayor LaGuardia didn't like it, Robert Moses didn't like it, and they did a huge renovation of the park, and it got moved to Queensborough Hall, where it stood for many years. And then in the 80s, people took umbrage again. And so I'm belaboring this because it was the impetus that got me involved in efforts to try to keep monuments where they were and to preserve them rather than to say they should go and we're going to remove them. But in fact, ultimately, the work was moved to Greenwood Cemetery. And the thing is, it has, the other dimension of it for me is that it has this fascinating history. Not just the controversies, but the factors that led the artist to choose that image. So it's very complex, and so and kind of insane history that involved Anthony Weiner also. For social and biographical reasons, biographical on the part of the artist, it showed me how rich and significant every single work of public art, every single monument's history can be. And so that's why it had an impact.
It seems like whether or not something is well received or controversial, if this interaction, each of these, the Sarah, that they're in the public eye and generate some sort of conversation. Is that what makes art public? Or is there something richer than that?
I think one of the most important parts of why we do public art is for that conversation to happen. And the hope is that the conversation could happen in a way where sides, whether it be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different opinions, are heard and respected, and hopefully move on to something that is, of some substance. In terms of, how one defines public art, and I think a lot of art in the public environment could just be labeled as public art, but I think when you think of when an artist is thinking about the space, the community, or the environment, and all these other factors and making it site-specific, that lends to a more substantive public artwork.
I'm kind of an infant when it comes to this idea of public art. My first work, City in the Grass, was in Madison Park this summer. And the idea of what happened was I was dragged out of the studio and asked to create a public art. It was a great thing on the part of the curator, Brooke Rappaport. But I was never really, I make large-scale works, but the idea of actually doing something in the public realm had not really ever, I've been in this since I was 13, making art. But public art has never really entered into my vocabulary. But realizing it now, that it actually can be very much a part of an additive, not only to my language, but in terms of how you actually give to the public and actually watching how the public reacts and how they become a part of the work. I see this as a huge plus, and for everyone to sort of gain in on how not only the process of making art, but what the sheer volume and parameters of like the idea of giving, because that's really in effect what art is. Bottom line is all about giving, and no matter whether it's public art or if it's indoor art, it's all about what comes from an individual and becomes a part of the walking around world.
I'm just curious, because most of the people that we work with, most of the artists that we work with have never done public art before, and so we're usually their first stint into that realm. And a lot of times people get addicted. I want to do another one, and other times, like, I never want to see this again. So I'm just curious, your first experience.
I'm of the former, not the latter. Only because of the like I was saying, the idea of giving. And then allowing the viewer to be complicit in completing the work. That was so much a part of my philosophy going in, and realizing how much of that was it was fully realized. And I'd like to see that happen again, but obviously working with materials that would be more permanent would be the key. And then also solving the puzzle of what permanence means in terms of, in public interaction. Those are the two elements I think that I would have to sort of bridge, because it was a lot easier to do something temporary and have it be felt and realized. But something made of your traditional materials that are about longevity, that would be the other puzzle. So for me, I like the idea of a puzzle, to be something to be solved.
So can I ask then, what adjustments, if any, did you have to make? So if you were a studio artist, right, primarily, what kinds of, what ways of thinking did you have to change, or adjustments in your thinking did you have to make in order to be able to do the current project,
Well, I
the
mean,
recent
the
project?
things that I do in the studio, if I were to take them outside, they would kill people, you know. Literally, they just would not be able to stand up to the weather, the wind. All these things have to be figured in. I mean, so if I was going to do like this, which was the first idea, this huge exploding tree monstrosity would have been in the center of the park, would have killed anyone and everybody. So the idea of actually making something sound and constructing it to the specs of the safety of the public, that is the first thing. I can make large scale things. That's what I do. But it's like, okay, now you have to make something large scale that's safe. And so these are the and then make something that actually works, within those parameters. In the end, as you're sort of like adding to your vocabulary or to your language, obviously this is a super positive once you've solved it. Though I think I'm still kind of on the edge of whether or not I've solved it. But I think that the next project would definitely be about permanence, and then realizing, of course, public safety.
So sort of formal technical materials, as opposed to having to sort of change your orientation toward your audience.
Yeah, you want to be honest about the work. You don't really want to compromise it. But at the same time, I mean, I'm telling you this, but don't tell anybody. But in the end, you need to sort of address those very, the subject of safety. If you're not used to, like if you're making successful works indoors, outdoor now, it's a whole different, set of rules. Yeah.
That's part of the challenge, is to sort of, create work in a material or for an environment that is outside of the studio and still keep the merits of who you are as an artist and what you do as an artwork. And so that's always a challenge when we're working with artists. So good on you. Good luck.
Thank you.
When you're thinking about the public, Leo, and City in the Grass, what in your working technique was the sort of aha moment, okay, I've got to do all of these things. Here, this is what this work has got to do. What was the aha moment for you that went from, I've got some ideas, okay, now I know what I'm going to do?
Well, it's these things do happen sort of piecemeal. As I was sort of taking in other projects at the same time, I was going back and forth to China for like 4 years, at the same time trying to realize what this Madison piece can be. And all the things that I learned, in the interim, meaning like just the kind of things that were coming into my life, I mean, color had not been a part of my work. I mean, if you're familiar with my work, color is not. And actually movement and action, those are all these elements that are now part of like City in the Grass has now been added to, my language. So, like all the colors that I worked with in porcelain in China, and all that started to come into play. There were a lot of aha moments. It was just a matter of like actually making sense of all that so that you, as a public could actually take it in and feel that it was yours, Bottom line, that was what that piece was about. It was about, it belongs to you, and you complete it. I can start it, but you complete it.
When we think about public art, we've had a lot. I realize our public art, what we consider in Evelson Chapel a public arts piece, is inside. The works that we've been talking about are all outside. Does it
But
have
there's
to be
an
outside to be
interesting-
public?
No, but there's an interesting. I mean, I sat in the chapel for an hour before, just earlier, and the very idea that you can live inside an artist's composition. I mean, that's what the chapel is. So I think that, for an artist to be able to sort of invite you in, on a spiritual level, physical level, emotional level. I mean, Louis Nevelson was all those things. It's a broad experience. It's not like this one-off in terms of like, okay, this is that. It's many things. So the idea that indeed it is. It's public art.
One thing is just to keep in mind that the notion of public art is fairly recent. So basically until late 60s or so, kind of around when Nevelson is starting to work, I mean not starting but is working here, it was called civic art usually. And then the term kind of shifts over to being art in the public realm, and it has to do partly with the kind of art that's made. So there's this shift over from statues and monuments and memorials that are figurative and academic in style to the more abstract stylistic mode. It's in the 70s, I mean, when Nevelson is working on this chapel, that in the late 60s and early 70s, that, say, in New York, you start to have sponsorship of work in the public realm. And that term comes from a woman named Doris Friedman, who was really important in the history of New York's art in the public realm, because she kind of got it out there into public spaces and tried to get government sponsorship for it in a big way, and then ultimately did. And it's at that time, late 60s, that there start to be these exhibits of more abstract art, more cutting edge art, at least as far as what the public was used to, being put out there. And for the first time, it doesn't have the same kind of overt civic, allegorical meaning that the older stuff did. So what interests me about the Nevelson, I mean, one of the things is that the chapel is being commissioned at about the same time that, say, the city of New York is really starting to get behind the idea of commissioning permanent public art that's also abstract, like Nevelson's, but by usually different artists. And although Nevelson did work in public spaces, like downtown on 92nd Street as well, the meaning of public art starts to shift and become this idea of public art as something that is supposed to resonate with audiences, and audiences start talking back and matter, but they don't talk back and matter in the way that they do now. So there's been an evolution or a change, and the demands for something that's public art to be public and what that means have gotten much more complicated than they used to be. So it's just something to keep in mind.
A lot of times it has to do with access as well. You know, how accessible is this work? And it doesn't have to be physically accessible, it can be visually accessible as well. When we commission a work and we think about the spaces that it's going in, we think about, is the public going to access it visually or physically? Like some of the school projects, schools aren't necessarily public buildings, but a lot of the folks that go in and out of there are not, you know, they're able to experience it in a way that that you wouldn't if you were going to a museum or a gallery or something like that. So access plays a big role in terms of how we define public art.
And so when you're working with an artist on a project, Kendal, and thinking about the idea of access, if you were going to do a project with Leo, I mean, what would that conversation be like? How does it unfold?
So we think about the space. We think about the audience, and sometimes there's an existing audience. Sometimes we don't know who the audience will be, and we think about how people, will interact with this particular space. And because it's a city project, then we also have to think about materials and safety and all that other stuff. And that's where the conversation begins. It's sort of like, let's have a conversation about this space. Where in here do people congregate or pass through or spend time in? How do those spaces, it could be one space, it could be many different spaces within this. And what do you see that could influence a design or a thought or an idea? And leave that up to the artists. And we're very hands-off in terms of we don't design with any artists. It's ridiculous. But we just provide the opportunity and see how, what inspires the work, and we go from there.
Yeah. Sounds good. It's fired up.
Do you discuss, I hate to keep bringing this up, but it's actually an issue. Do you discuss maintenance with the artist, and so what they have to keep in mind, and who's going to do it, who's going to take care of it and stuff?
Yeah, the conversation around maintenance comes way before we even start talking to an artist, and that plays into that conversation. So where we put the artwork, every facility is different, right? So the maintenance in a school, the maintenance requirements in a school is very different than in a library, different than a police station. Sometimes the facility has the capabilities of maintaining something, like in a university setting, for example, they may be able to maintain technology and electronics, whereas in a sewage treatment plant, maybe not. That conversation happens way before we even start thinking about where the artwork needs to go and how we engage an artist. A work high up to sort of maintain this wreath, it's very different than if it was, where it's touchable. So all these play into that conversation. And even when an artist is coming in with a proposal or a thought, then we sort of discuss that as well.
It would be interesting to know whether there were discussions with Louise Nevelson about maintenance.
Yeah.
Whether that came up in the commissioning of the chapel. I would not assume it was.
Well, it's interesting. So part of what we're addressing 40 years on is, the fundamental enemy of the artwork was the old HVAC system, which was unregulated humidity. So we'd have humidity movements from 7% to almost 80%. That kind of swing is not friendly to wood and paint. Leo and I were in the chapel. I was pointing out the grills that delivered that conditioned air were directly above the sculptures, just blowing directly on this. So here's very hot and very dry air. Let's just blow it directly on. So it doesn't seem that if there was a conversation, the number of things that we're sort of addressing now, 40 years later, it wasn't thinking, I think, in the way that you're thinking today, Kendal, and sort of working with artists and thinking through these issues. In the chapel, you can go right up next to it. You can bump into it if you want. There's nothing there. We have missing parts.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I did see that.
Yeah. And I wonder if you were to do this, Leo.
I love missing parts.
That's yeah. So how would you do a work for the city?
So much of my how I go about making things and realizing what finish means. Like when we were speaking on looking at Nevelson's pieces, it was like I said, you should leave that. And you were saying, yeah.
So you, exactly.
There were cracks, there were missing things, and it was just like, I thought it was just beautiful, but that would be my work. So I think the philosophy of the artist should be addressed. We talk about permanence, yes, but in the end, what aspects of the holistically speaking of the actual artist philosophy is embedded in this idea public. When I'm speaking with Brooke, I have to inform them that it was, in order for this piece to finish itself, the public had to actually attack it. And on the other end of that, we were going to get a work of art. And I'm not sure if that ever sunk in. Because on the around the piece, it's like, do not climb signs. And it's like, I say, okay, that's kind of going against.
Liability
yeah, understood. But it was like whenever I was there, I would say, climb, get up there, And it was always a matter of, like I said, understanding that on the other end of this, we're going to get something more magnificent. And the beginning is only the first patina. And when looking at Nevelson's work, I mean, I see nothing but beauty in all those cracks, but you're saying we need to fix this. So addressing what, I also spoke to Arnie Gumcher's son about, he said he would visit Nevelson and would with the hot glue, and she was doing with all these things are not archival. So the thinking, understanding the artist thinking up against what permanence is, it's usually two different things. So this is an interesting issue, I think.
And another thing that's sort of interesting, it just occurred to me, is, so 1977, if you think about if you were around in New York in the late 1970s, the absence of money, resources to take care of what was already here was very vivid, and you saw it in the monuments around the city. So the statues in Central Park and the main memorial, the graffiti that was all pervasive on these things was a function of there not being the money, among other things, or a certain consciousness about taking care of the artistic legacy that we have now, fortunately. And so it's just an interesting, so in thinking about whether Nevelson was conscious of these things, and it's one of the things, obviously, too, that this idea of temporary art, impermanence, starts to be really big in the 1970s. And the city of New York played a big role in putting out there in the public realm artwork that was only there on a temporary basis. So before Percent for Art became a law in 1982, the city, specifically under Lindsay, gets involved in putting on these various temporary exhibitions of cutting-edge art, and they're doing it in places like Washington Heights and all over the city, but a lot of the works were sort of permanent artworks that were then placed in public spaces on a temporary basis, as opposed to just art with impermanent materials and things like that. But this consciousness about ephemerality and stuff, it becomes a big thing in the mid to late 1970s.
And we still do it now through some of the other city departments, like the Department of Transportation and the Parks Department. They have very robust temporary art programs that places artwork in parks and plazas and streetscapes and whatnot. So, and that allows for artists to experiment, and we really support those types of programs because you could be a little bit more provocative with temporary artwork because it's going to go away in a couple of weeks or a month, and an artist could experiment. Let's see if this material is going to last, or let's see this subject matter. You could address contemporary issues that way. So yeah.
Have you had a piece that began as a temporary piece that when you went to remove it because its time had come, the community responded and said, "Oh no, keep it here"?
Oh yeah.
What do you do then?
We tend to keep it there. So, for example, who's familiar with the Cube or the Alamo? Yeah. So that is a good example. This was a very temporary artwork in the 60s by Doris Friedman, put it there, and the community did not want it to go. And actually, when we removed it, was it last year, to clean it, there was a bit of an uproar. What happened? And it's just celebrated almost like its 50th anniversary. So yeah, there's a power of One of the things that we always hope for a work of public art is the ownership by the people that surround it. And so our process of commissioning a work sort of garners that relationship that the people own it. For a very long time when commissioning work, we had a hard time assessing the success of the work. And for a while it used to be if it's there the next day, then it's successful. But now, we sort of really engage in a way that, once the piece is complete, it's no longer ours, but it's just the commission's, but it's no longer belongs to the artist, but belongs to the entire community. And that's a good example of that, what happened to the Alamo.
Do you have mechanisms in Percent for Art for assessing success that are, like data-driven or surveys and things like that?
Yeah, any kind of public artwork like that's permanent, that's longevity, it's hard to do that. It's almost impossible to do that. And in the field, we've been trying to figure out ways to do that. That's, because a public artwork, unless it's in a very specific community that you live with it, and, then it's hard to gauge what people think about it. People are very transient throughout the spaces in the public, so it's hard to have a really definitive data on that. So we address it in the other way, through the commissioning process. Make sure that there is a lot of engagement as much as possible, and hopefully ownership, takes it on. It takes a while to gauge that success anyway. So you see that when you start to remove the work or start to do things to the work and see the response. That's the closest that we could get to figuring out. Besides that, before we start commissioning a work, we think about what we want the art to do, and is it doing that throughout the process? And that's another way to say, well, is it working? Is our intentions valid?
So I'm curious, because we've kind of traced a bit of a long history of public art in this city, from the Moses days through to Doris Friedman, the 60s and 70s, down to today. We have Nevelson, we've got Leo working in public art today. So the arc here has been greater and greater investment in, and I don't want to use the word formality, but many, instead of not only public fund or private funding, but public funding, city agencies, et cetera. In New York City, this arc leads us to today. So what I'm wondering is, 10 years from now, what are your hopes for public art? And what perhaps is inhibiting your hopes for public art 10 years from now? What might need to change in order to accomplish it? Maybe particularly from a working artist who wants to do another commission. What?
Boy, 10 years from now.
Yeah.
I mean that's a light years really.
Go 5.
In terms of where we are, I think politically, and what we're up against, and how we need to sort of address issues. With certainty, I'm sure that public art will be of a moment, that will say, hey, this is what we're about, and this is where we stand, and allowing these things to happen is what we're talking about here. Actually, taking off the shackles, so to speak, in order to sort of allow serious work to sort of exist. When I mentioned in the beginning Tilted Art, that was one of those moments. It's actually was ahead of its time for what the kind of issues, the kind of questions that it asked, of the artists and of the public. As we're going 10 years forward, I think this kind of art, how it, like you look at, Frank Gehry's, pieces. I see them as sculptures. Who are living inside these sculptures, and they're, the investment in the actual large-scale sculpture. This is what that is. There's just more, I think, that the public will be asked. The artists will actually engage, and then we'll meet the next level of where we need to be. And that's just the way it is in terms of us as human beings. We're continuing to sort of like challenge ourselves, but the artist will always be the soothsayer. Sarah was that in the early 80s. And I think that the answer to that is Frank Gehry. So the next phase of that will be, 10 years from now, you know, it's up in the air, but I think that it's going to be great.
The Fed will put the Richard Serra back.
I was curious. So what do we learn from missing pieces or pieces that have been removed? Yeah.
Well said.
I think 10 years from now, what I would like to see is more artist-initiated public artwork, where it's where the government and the private sector just allow artists to really express themselves in the public in ways that are at least expected. That's what I hope.
How do you see that happening? You work for the city. How do you make that happen?
I mean, working for the city, I mean, there's simple things we could probably do by just allowing it to happen. You know, some of our city agencies have, rightfully so, strict permitting processes, maybe streamlining some of that to allow, artists to come into a space and understand, I think a lot of it is understanding not the restrictions, but the limitations of a public environment, but allowing them to, experiment. We get a lot, like almost what you're saying, there's a lot that we could learn from experimentation. There's a lot we could learn from the language of art. And I think that's, just loosening some of the restrictions perhaps and allowing a lot more to happen.
I would just have to, I don't disagree. I would have to wonder whether it were possible to do that within, under city sponsorship. Certainly given the way things are and have been, I can't imagine. Because even programs like the DOT Urban Art Program, which is temporary works that are in oftentimes spaces near major transportation hubs and or along the streets and things like that. That's under DOT, the Department of Transportation. And that agency is huge. It's extreme. I think it's become extremely powerful in ways that it wasn't even 15 years ago. And they have more rules than anybody. So about what you can do and things like trip hazards, and so it would be very interesting to see how your challenge could be implemented.
So the question was, what would you like to see? Right. We're in a church. Got to have a little faith here. Got to have a little faith. That's what I would love to see.
For 10 years. This is it.
I'm the realist.
I'm thinking too. So we've talked about city. This place, of course, was a partnership between a church and a bank, development. We see all sorts of development around us. Lots of buildings, both corporate buildings, private resident buildings. I think about some of the great buildings of the city, Art Deco buildings that have the art that's incorporated into them. How do we do more of that in the buildings that are going up all around us? What's the place of art in those buildings?
You mean,
and
how do you
outside?
get more public-private partnerships to do more, in effect, corporate art? Corporate-sponsored art.
And not necessarily in the sense of we're a corporation and we're collecting, we have our collection.
Right.
But, we're building this office tower and we want to integrate art into it that interacts with the public on a day-to-day basis.
That was the model that we started to see in the 50s with Chase Bank downtown, and then on into the 60s and 70s. But things did shift over away from putting art in on the street to bringing it into the lobby, and then toward corporate collecting.
Right.
That seems to have evolved in the 90s or so, and now they're not even doing that. So, and I don't know why that changed as far as, say, the work on 6th Avenue that you see, the Jim Dine, and so I forget when those are from the 80s. And that was big then, but you don't see it now. And why that is, it's a good question, how one brings it back.
Yeah, I think you see it in very small pockets throughout the city. There's some of it in Dumbo, for example, with the development that's happening there. And a lot of it is not just static public artwork, but there's like art programming that happens. And then we have organizations like, Creative Time and the Public Art Fund that have a lot of corporate sponsorships that do things throughout the city, and some of them have spaces that they reactivate over and over again. So it may not have been exactly like it started, but it has evolved to a different kind of thing.
Right. I mean, so what the corporate sponsorship comes in the big way with the business improvement districts and the conservancies like Madison Square Park Conservancy, where you have surrounding businesses that are contributing to funds that then are applied to art programs in sometimes the parks like Madison Square Park, or like Public Art Fund, which would raise money in order to put on, and that's a nonprofit, and Public Art Fund works with the city. So what you have now a lot more are these relationships and collaborations between the city of New York, or the state sometimes, not so much the federal government, but city, state, and then these nonprofits that are really dedicated to trying to bring art into the public realm. And so that's kind of taken over where the buildings have fallen by the wayside. So I'm just repeating what you're saying.
So I have one sort of question I think that maybe will bring us to a conclusion. We've talked about city, we've talked about private funding, corporate funding, private-public partnerships, et cetera. What can the average person, the average New Yorker, do to support the flourishing of public art in our city? Climb on it, right? Lee, I just know what you're thinking.
You want to tax the public? Make sure that, my goodness, public.
Yeah, what can the average person do to support the flourishing of arts in our city, public art in particular?
Boy, I mean, erasing the art programs in schools, I think has actually a direct effect at times on just public art, how we see art. I think that we need to readdress that so that we can start, becoming spiritually larger when it comes to actually what we need for nourishment. Art is that. And I think you have to start at the ground. So it starts there, and then it expands out.
Right. Education, education, education. History, history, art history, and
absolutely.
And also art education and aesthetic education. My sense is people, including college students, people don't know how to look at things, and they don't know how to understand art in the public realm. And this is in general, but kids need that, and they're not getting it. And so there's a tendency to look at, and again, I focus on sort of older stuff, but look at things as flat images, even though they occupy public space, and that occupation of public space has both a physical, a psychological dimension, and a broader social and sociological dimension. And so people end up coming to art in the public realm with a very, very limited conception, and then have knee-jerk reactions to what they see. We're seeing some of the impact of that, I believe, in the present day, exacerbated by political traumas in the nation, because people look at things in a very limited way. So without getting into what I mean by that, there needs to be more art education in the schools. I mean, and so the money, and so one other thing an average person can do is support organizations that do that, support the organizations that put the art out there. And the other thing an average person can do is read the history of public art. Read my books.
Nothing to add. She just said everything I was going to say. I'm good.
I'm just struck at this conversation. The four of us had a chance to meet, 5 or 10 minutes just before we came out here, and how rich this has been. I wish we could keep going. It really seems that we've only begun to sort of scratch the surface of this topic. And as we have just scratched the surface of it, we've done it in a very New York way. I'm particularly grateful to have had the three of you with us to offer these unique perspectives. As a historian, someone working in the civic arena now, and as a working artist, what a great gift to all of us that the three of you are with us this night. And then there's, of course, the rest of us who are here, all of us who are engaged in this city, shaped day in and day out by public art, consciously and unconsciously. So no wonder, all of us here tonight could really only scratch the surface of this topic. I also want to say thank you for honoring Louise Nevelson tonight, and this masterwork that is so close to the hearts of many and is really close to us physically now. And so I invite you all to spend some time in Nevelson Chapel when we conclude. The chapel is meant for about 24 people. So if 200 people decide to go there immediately, we will have risk to damage. So please stagger your visits. Nevelson crafted this as a singular place of quiet reflection, an oasis in the midst of our city, and it's housed right here in the former City Bank Center at St. Peter's Church, and cared for by all of us in this room for the sake of future generations. So thank you all for being with us this night.